The story began with a woman defeating a villain named Rufus lay lightless. His head was cut off and rolled to the ground, showing a face full of despair. The woman celebrated with her teammates after their victory. But the protagonist could not accept that ending. He believed it should never have happened. He looked as if he had just woken from a terrible dream. This boy was the heir to the Marquisate of Lightless, and there was no way he could allow such a pathetic death to become real. He had to prevent it no matter what. When a butler asked where he was going, the boy said they needed to hurry to Roguebelt. If that nightmare had even the slightest chance of coming true, he would destroy it with everything he had. A day earlier, in the mansion of the Lightless family, Rufus, the young heir, sat at the table staring blankly at his food. His personal butler, Carlos, approached and joked that such a pouty look would ruin his cute face. Rufus told him to stop calling him cute, reminding him that he was already 12 years old. Carlos replied that cuteness was justice. Rufus became angry and warned that today might be the day of the butler's life. Carlos calmly said he was not afraid to lay down his short life for him. Rufus told him that a servant's life and fate were always in the hands of his master. He found it insulting to be called cute because he was already an adult who drank black coffee every day. He took another sip and noticed its pleasant aroma, realizing that the brewer had worked hard to perfect it. The butler then said that if he died, Rufus would no longer be able to drink such good coffee, which would be a real loss. Rufus paused for a few seconds and claimed he would allow him to live long out of mercy. The butler had no objection and promised to live a long and humble life. Still, Carlos pointed out that Rufus seemed to be in a bad mood that morning. Rufus blamed it on the butler's provocation. Carlos denied any fault, though he mentioned that Rufus's last time being this upset was when he fired one of his magic instructors, had already driven away several magic tutors. Rufus claimed it had been quite recent. He fired them off due to their boldness of teaching the great hymn. Carlos then asked him to ease his mind even a little. He asked for a reason why he was getting upset recently. After thinking for a while, Rufus told him that it was neither a cute nor a funny story. He said he had an endlessly long and terrible dream, then began to tell it. In his dream, there was a young commoner who entered the Academy of Magic. The cruel and arrogant aristocrats looked down on him. But when disaster threatened the world, he joined forces with his friends and defeated the demon lords and dark gods, saving the whole world. In the end, he married the princess and became the king. Carlos said with excitement that it was a powerful story full of drama and happiness, one that would surely become popular. But Rufus grew angry and shouted that there was nothing exciting about it. He asked for coffee to be brought. In his dream, he had seen 5 chapters from the life of the unknown commoner, and complained how he sat through all 5 of them in that dream. The butler agreed, but suddenly realized something. He suggested that the story should be expanded, adding a part between the first and second chapters regarding showing a bit too much sympathy towards the villain's side. He said the villains should be made more relatable to ordinary people so the book would sell better. Rufus asked if Carlos wanted to be his editor. The butler then proposed that Rufus write a book based on his dreams, but Rufus told Carlos to say that again after writing one himself. Rufus added that this was not the time for humor. There were moments in the first and second chapters that deeply worried him. In those parts, several evil aristocrats, including himself as one of the villains, were killed by the heroes in the most pathetic way. Carlos curiously asked what kind of wicked acts Rufus had done as a villain. Rufus reminded him of the first chapter of the story, wherein a villainous noble mocked the main character. At the same time, Rufus himself was one of that villain's lackeys. But after that, he was cunning and insidious as a minor villain. Carlos listens to his story with understanding and attention. In the second chapter, Rufus becomes a subordinate of the second demon king, one of the 4 heavenly kings, the Shadow Wolf, Rufus. The title Shadow Wolf always fascinated Carlos. Rufus often said he had fought fairly well, but in the second chapter of the story, he died in a very plain and unexciting way. Carlos then realized that his young master was feeling displeased because he was cast as a villain who died halfway through the story. Rufus told the butler that he shouldn't be laughing either since he was his opening act. In other words, Carlos died before he did. He was the dark butler, Carlos. Carlos listened carefully to the story and felt deeply moved. Even in his dreams, he still tried to protect his young master, which made him proud, though it did not help much in the end since they both died. Rufus then came back to his senses with his mood improved a little. He asked his butler to go over their day's schedule. Carlos reminded his master about the day's plan. He had a herbalism practice in the garden and a lecture on economics later that afternoon. While they walked toward the garden, a large tree suddenly fell because its roots had rotted, blocking their way. Rufus asked what had happened. The gardener suggested taking another route instead of waiting for the path to be cleared, but Rufus became upset. He thought his time was too valuable to waste compared to ordinary workers like them. He told everyone to step aside and cast his dark magic called Dark Scythe. The crowd quickly ran away. In a blink, the fallen tree split apart. A new maid admired his powerful magic but made a small remark about his behavior. The gardener noticed she was new and told her to look down. The maid was shocked to see the tree neatly cut into firewood-sized pieces. She realized the young master had done it that way so it would be easier to clean and reuse. The gardener said their master was hard to understand, and they all began carrying the firewood together. As Rufus and Carlos continued walking, the butler gently mentioned that his master might try being kinder to commoners. Rufus claimed he just helped them finish their work faster, but Carlos went on to say that Rufus often appeared cold and proud, even though he was still very young. He explained that all the servants had been trained to serve and respect him. However, his attitude could earn him resentment. Rufus believed that too much kindness could make servants lose their discipline and take advantage of him. He felt it was his duty as an aristocrat to uphold the family's honor. While common people worked hard in the fields and sweated, he was being trained to lead, study, and master many subjects. He had to learn arithmetic, language, combat, economics, etiquette, and magic, all while attending endless lectures and practical lessons. To him, being strict and serious was not just a choice, but a necessary image to keep the dignity of his noble family. That was precisely why that story in his dream disgusted him. What could a commoner with nothing but brute strength possibly do to save the world? Evening arrived. In his room, Rufus was still haunted by the strange dream. He had not told Carlos the full truth, but it was a prophetic dream, clear, detailed, and vivid. As Rufus thought back to it, he remembered that besides the commoner who became king, there were other figures he recognized besides himself. In the second part of the dream, the one who called himself the second demon lord was someone named Raymond Roy Nodens Gallon, and several well-known people appeared among the heavenly kings. Rufus had never met Raymond in person, though he had heard about him. The thought bothered him. Why was a duke's son called himself the demon lord, and why had he, Rufus, served under him? Questions like these filled his mind as he wondered what would happen to him once he entered the academy. Sleep slowly took over and Rufus drifted back into the same dream. The protagonist stood before him asking if there was no other way and talking about someone being sacrificed. It was the same dream, but this time the scene showed a different point of view from the same moment that usually ended his dream. He found himself as the Shadow Wolf, the same creature from his dream, who told the protagonist and his friends not to come near because their commoner smell suffocated him. Rufus thought he would die again just like before, but he could not accept such an ending, especially if this Shadow Wolf would become his future self. When he cast dark magic, he immediately felt his mana running out even before the fight truly began. He wondered what was happening and why he was being forced to fight while pretending to stay calm. He questioned if this Shadow Wolf was a fool. As the battle went on, a screen showed the Shadow Wolf's health dropping fast. The female hero released her magic and declared that she would be the one to kill him. Rufus recognized those exact words from his earlier dreams. His body would not move. He could not even raise a defense. He wanted to ask them to stop. He did not know any of them. He did not want to die, but still, he was killed again. Rufus felt sharp pain run through his body. Even though it was a dream, the pain felt real. In an instant, the scene returned to the moment before the fight started. The Shadow Wolf spoke the same proud words again, but this time he used a different dark spell. Rufus noticed that this was not exactly the same event since the opening move had changed. However, he still ended up defeated and burned to death. He heard the crackling of flames and smelled his own body burning. The heat felt real and the agony was unbearable. The fight restarted again and Rufus died once more, this time in a different way. Each death hurt terribly. The next loop ended with him being torn apart by wind magic. The battle repeated endlessly, but Rufus had no idea who these heroes were avenging. The female hero blamed him for the death of someone named Norn, and for torturing the villagers with heavy taxes. She insulted Rufus more than anyone else and attacked him again and again to finish him off. Since he always died anyway, he asked her to end everything in one strike. No matter how many times the dream repeated, the Shadow Wolf was always defeated. Rufus thought that the version of him in the dream should heal himself, maybe even have a healing potion. He wondered why he had to wait for the enemy's turn to end, as if he were stuck in a card battle with turns. When the fight started once more, the heroes threw more insults at him. His sense of reason slowly faded. He began to question if he had truly done anything wrong. He wondered why this scene kept repeating. His entire body and soul were crushed again and again, yet the cycle never stopped. He clung to his identity even though dying repeatedly tore him apart. In the end, he just wished to stop existing. By then, the number of times he had died reached 20,802,001. Rufus finally woke up from a nightmare, his eyes looking lifeless. After staring at the ceiling for a long moment, he slid down to the floor. He slowly walked toward the door and called for someone. Hearing the noise, Carlos ran to him. Rufus asked if he was really Carlos. Carlos tried to calm him, explaining that he was his personal butler and would never leave him alone. Rufus dropped to the floor and broke into tears. He broke down. He exclaimed that he didn't want to die anymore. He ended up crying on the butler's arms. An hour passed, yet Rufus still could not calm down. He continued crying while hugging Carlos tightly, and when he planted his face on his chest, he complained about the smoky smell. Carlos explained that he had dropped everything the moment he heard the crash and rushed to his master. He felt like he had been used as a handkerchief. Hearing this made Rufus feel relieved and grateful. He appreciated how quickly Carlos had come to help him. The butler noticed that Rufus was slowly returning to normal, but he wondered why a man who was always so full of himself had suddenly lost control. He claimed even the other servants were quite startled. A few maids peeked through the crack of the door. Annoyed by their curiosity, Rufus told them to return to their work and stop wasting time. The maids quickly apologized and left. One of them quietly thought that their master looked quite cute with his red nose, while another felt suddenly inspired to work harder to comfort him. Rufus realized that many people had seen his breakdown. Feeling ashamed, he thought it might be better to live alone in another house. When Carlos asked what was wrong, Rufus only said it was nothing. He mentioned that he had another nightmare and then went to the restroom. Carlos started to worry, thinking this was a bad sign since it was already the second day in a row. Meanwhile, Rufus could not stop thinking about his dream. In it, he had felt countless deaths and endless pain until he almost lost himself. To him, it didn't feel like a dream but an experience. He feared that experience might someday turn real. Still, he reminded himself that he had no reason to follow the same path as in that story. Instead of accepting such a miserable end, he would fight, no matter how shameful it might look. After thinking for a while, he realized that if he had possessed enough magical power, he might have survived. Or if he had never become one of the 4 heavenly kings, maybe those deadly battles would never have happened. He recalled that the story began when the characters entered the Magic Academy 3 years in the future. He believed that avoiding the main hero would be enough to escape his tragic fate. But then he remembered a girl from his dream who was followed by a water spirit. She kept saying that the villagers suffered from heavy taxes because of the lightless family. It was clear she held a personal grudge against Rufus. After that, he called for the butler. The butler asked if Rufus did not like the warm milk. Rufus was surprised to realize he was actually drinking milk. He told them to stop joking and ordered the butler to check if there was a village in their land that had suffered from heavy taxes. Carlos promised to investigate, though he doubted that the taxes in their territory were higher than in other areas. Rufus kept remembering 2 words: taxes and village. There had been an episode in the story about subduing sea monsters. Those creatures had attacked a fishing village, which caused the fish supply to drop and made paying taxes almost impossible. Rufus realized he needed to recall the name of that village. It might be the link between his dream and reality. Then he casually mentioned the name Roguebelt. Upon hearing it, Carlos explained that Roguebelt was a small fishing village within their territory. He was surprised that his master was concerned about taxes in such a distant place. Rufus dropped his utensils in shock. He could not believe that Roguebelt actually existed. Carlos asked if Rufus was really worrying about taxes in such a small area. Rufus had thought the name came only from his dream, something unreal, yet it was part of the real world. Seeing Rufus's pale face, Carlos assumed he was unwell and suggested rescheduling his plans for the day. Rufus, however, believed that if the name of that remote fishing village was real, it could not be a coincidence. In his nightmare, he had died many times, and he was sure he could not be mistaken. He pushed aside his breakfast and rushed out into the street. Carlos called after him, asking where he was going, and Rufus answered that they needed to head to Roguebelt at once. Carlos tried to stop him, insisting that they needed guards, a coachman, and permission from the family head first. Rufus replied that Carlos himself could serve as both guard and coachman. If there were any consequences, he wanted Carlos to tell his father that he alone had taken full responsibility. But Carlos refused, and firmly suggested at least informing the family head. Frustrated, Rufus shouted that he suddenly wanted to eat fresh fish that very moment. Carlos then understood what he truly meant and promised to prepare everything for the trip. As Carlos walked away, Rufus remembered that in his dream, his own death had also meant Carlos's death. Everything he had, including his life, was his alone. No one had the right to take it from him, not even God. If fate planned to strike him down, he would strike first, even if it was only a second earlier. He swore to change the future where he had once died. After a long journey, Rufus and Carlos finally arrived at the fishing village. Rufus thought the place looked strange. Carlos checked a map and confirmed that the village was called Roguebelt. They entered Roguebelt, a small fishing village on the edge of their family's territory. As they walked through the quiet streets, they noticed how empty everything felt. Rufus remembered seeing this village in the story from his dream, where it had more people, even though they suffered under heavy taxes. In that story, the main character came here to defeat sea monsters, and a girl later joined his crew. Rufus remembered that the same girl had once cut off his head with fierce anger. Despite feeling scared, he needed to find some kind of clue in Roguebelt, since he could not return home with nothing. Carlos spotted a hotel sign further down the street and eagerly pointed it out to Rufus, saying they might also get to try the local fish dishes there. The thought of fish made Rufus realize he had wanted to eat some. When they reached the hotel entrance, Rufus noticed that Carlos had sharp eyesight since from a distance he had mistaken the building for a doghouse. They went inside and found the hotel owner sleeping behind the counter. Carlos tried to wake him up. The man, still half asleep, grumbled and asked if they were the ones who came to collect money again. He said he had nothing left in the shop and told Carlos he was wasting his time. Carlos politely apologized for disturbing him and explained that he only wanted to ask a few questions for his master. The hotel owner looked puzzled that someone so young could be a master. He asked if Carlos was not ashamed to be ordered around by a child. The butler scolded him for his rudeness and proudly said he served a noble and worthy young master. The owner gave Carlos a mocking look and hinted that he acted like a slave. Carlos calmly told Rufus that this was how an untrained commoner behaved. Rufus stayed composed while Carlos told the owner that they did not expect capital-level service and only wanted to know what was happening in the village and why it was so empty. The man hesitated and said that such information usually came with a price. Rufus understood and placed a bag of gold coins on the counter. Still, the owner continued to act rudely and ungrateful. A girl's voice came from behind him asking her father to stop being rude. The owner shouted angrily that he had told her to stay hidden. The girl fell to her knees and bowed her head, begging for forgiveness and also asking pardon from her father for his disrespect. The owner yelled again and demanded that she raise her head. The girl scolded her father instead, saying these people were different from the usual visitors and that he should bow his head as well. Rufus wondered what kind of foolish scene this was and if their words were even reaching their minds. At that moment, a group of young villagers rushed into the inn after hearing the shout, saying they came to help. They turned to the butler and asked if everything was fine. Then they saw the girl kneeling on the floor and anger quickly filled their faces. The crowd began calling Carlos a wicked old man after seeing him force their beloved Lilia to kiss his shoes. Their anger grew, furious that he would dare treat her that way. Many thought he was carrying a weapon. Then the owner shouted that the old man was only a servant, and the real boss was the short one beside him. Everyone was stunned. The noise in the crowd grew even louder. People shouted that they would not spare even a child. Some angrily asked if they were goons sent by Clinton. The shouting made Rufus's head ache. He thought the whole village was filled with foolish people who couldn't see the truth. How could they mistake him for someone's hired thug? Carlos then guessed they were talking about Clinton Fau Serpente, the local magistrate of Roguebelt. Rufus felt puzzled for a moment. In the third part of that dream, he had heard a story about a magistrate who unfairly raised taxes and made people suffer. He remembered that he had once died because of that man's cruelty and sins. Rufus tried to stay calm and asked if anyone could speak with him properly and tell him more about this Clinton. The crowd only grew more shocked, unable to believe how bold and arrogant he seemed. Suddenly, someone in the crowd shouted, and a man stepped forward. He had long hair tied in a braid. He mocked the crowd and said the boy was a true noble, warning that anyone who harmed him would lose their head. People felt relieved when Greg appeared. He apologized for the crowd around them and promised he would not let anyone else cause trouble if they let Lilia go. Rufus pointed out that if Greg knew he faced an aristocrat, he should show better manners and at least say who he was. Greg bowed and said he led the local sailors. Rufus felt they could at least have a conversation. Carlos noticed Greg stood with one hand on his sword. That small gesture showed he had experience. Although he seemed rough, Greg looked like someone who could be reasoned with. Rufus made it clear he had not been holding Lilia. The girl lowered her head and looked afraid. The others doubted Rufus. He walked up to Lilia, took her hand, and gently pulled her up. She felt as if she had become a noble lady for a moment. This showed what a true gentleman could do. Rufus then moved toward Greg and pushed Lilia toward him. Greg realized Rufus seemed distant, but was not a bad child. Still, everyone thought Rufus was hard to tolerate. Greg stepped closer and wondered if Rufus had come to the village with bad intent. Rufus answered that needlessly wiping out a whole village would only cause trouble. Greg glared at Rufus, who started to wonder if this was one of those moments when commoners turned against a noble out of anger. If a fight broke out, Rufus thought, it would count as treason, and the whole village could be executed under the kingdom's law. But Greg said he didn't care about such laws. Instead, he asked if Rufus would forgive them for their rudeness if they cried and bowed their heads in thanks for his mercy. Rufus coldly replied that he had no interest in Greg's head. But if Greg really wanted to bow, then he could go ahead. Rufus didn't care about this matter at all. Greg was caught off guard by his response. He couldn't figure out what kind of noble Rufus was, but he was sure Rufus was nothing like that Clinton scoundrel. Rufus said he did have one demand. He wanted to know more about Clinton. He started by asking if the villagers were truly on bad terms with him. Hearing Clinton's name made Greg furious. He said that if anyone ever saw Clinton's face again, they would risk their lives just to kill him. Rufus remarked that it felt like he was talking to a barbarian instead of a commoner. Grieg didn't even try to deny it. He went on to explain that Clinton had been robbing the village under the excuse of tax collection and even kidnapping women when there was nothing left to take. Clinton, he said, was far more savage than the villagers themselves. Grieg then apologized for having to tell such a terrible story to someone as young as Rufus. At that moment, someone from the street shouted for Greg. A man was yelling that Clinton's people were coming and they were already getting closer. Greg rushed outside, ordered everyone not to leave the property, and turned to Carlos, telling him to protect the young master. Carlos already knew his duty and didn't need more instructions. Rufus then called out to Carlos and told him that if things were truly that bad, they should try petitioning the Lightless family right away. Greg yelled back that he would think about that and left. Carlos believed that Greg didn't understand what was really happening, and Rufus muttered that ignorance was really a crime. Meanwhile, Clinton's men moved through the streets shouting that they were collecting taxes and demanding that everyone hand over their remaining valuables. They warned that anyone who resisted would be killed. A group of local sailors armed with pitchforks, clubs, and whatever they could find came forward to fight. They had nothing left to give and charged at the soldiers. A violent fight broke out, turning the street into chaos. Rufus and Carlos watched the scene from the hotel window. Rufus claimed he didn't recall learning that forced collection was carried out through proper procedures. Carlos replied what was happening was nothing but daylight robbery. Just then, the front door of the hotel burst open from a hard kick. One of the collectors spotted Lilia hiding inside and called out to his captain. Lilia tried to run and called for her father to follow, but he was busy gathering their family treasures and couldn't make it in time. The soldier saw her, and the father begged them to let his daughter go, offering all the family silver instead. The guards ignored him and shoved the father aside roughly. Rufus asked Carlos if it was possible for him to personally deal with Clinton. The butler calmly replied that he could not act without the head of the family's permission. Rufus thought that, as the eldest son, he should have some authority over lower officials, but he knew that doing so would make it seem like he was blaming his father for appointing them. He believed the best approach was to gather evidence of wrongdoing and find the real cause of the problems before taking any action. Carlos listened carefully and saw in Rufus the qualities of a future family head. The young man had a strong sense of justice and already showed the ability to manage a small territory. However, when Carlos noticed Rufus's angry expression, he quickly withdrew his thoughts. Meanwhile, the captain of Clinton's inspection team spotted Rufus and Carlos. He ordered his men to take all their valuables and to kill the old butler if he resisted. The captain himself turned his attention to the young girl, pushing her down under the excuse of inspecting her. Lilia cried for help, but Rufus remained seated during the chaos. Carlos, judging the situation with his years of experience, realized it was time to act. He stepped forward, called the collectors fools, and declared that he would never let bandits rob his master. The men were shocked to be called bandits, but Carlos went further and called them vermin instead. Angered, one of the collectors charged at Carlos with a sword, shouting that the dark nobles supported them, and that House Lightless stood behind their actions. He called Carlos insolent for daring to resist. Carlos blocked the attack, putting his body between Rufus and the blade. Rufus saw clearly that his loyal butler had risked his life for him. Trembling, Carlos turned to Rufus, his face pale and marked with a small bleeding cut. Rufus rose to his feet, his anger burning. He declared that the collector had wounded his servant and insulted the name of House Lightless. That alone was enough reason to punish Clinton and his men. Calling upon the magic of the Hand of Darkness, Rufus unleashed his power. In an instant, the collectors froze, unable to move. He dragged them out of the room and threw them aside like broken dolls. Shock spread through the group as they saw their captain fall. The captain stood back up, his face twisted with rage, and ordered his men to kill both Rufus and Carlos. As they walked outside, Rufus praised the butler for his impressive acting skills. Carlos then asked the young master if he should finish everyone off, but Rufus told him to keep it moderate. He explained that it was hard to tell the barbarians apart from the villagers, and they couldn't risk hurting innocent people. Using magic in this situation was too dangerous, so Rufus ordered Carlos to handle the enemies on his own. The butler accepted without hesitation. Carlos stepped forward and moved with incredible speed, showing flawless swordsmanship. Despite his age, he leaped around lightly, striking with perfect precision. In a short time, he defeated each of the collectors one by one. His movements showed great power and control, and soon the entire battle was over. When Greg arrived, he was shocked to see that the old man had single-handedly taken down an entire squad. Carlos bowed and apologized to Rufus for showing such a rough scene, but Rufus was pleased. He reminded everyone that his butler had once been a captain of the Dark Knights under House Lightless, and even in old age his skill with the blade remained remarkable. Carlos looked proud and honored by his master's praise. At that moment, Clinton's men hurriedly retreated. Greg shouted after them, telling Clinton that the village would take this matter straight to the Lord since they would no longer keep Pewishade around. Rufus could not tell them that the direct appeal had already been achieved through his presence. As they left the village, Carlos asked the young master if it was right to let the private soldiers escape. Rufus said it was fine because they were heading to Clinton's mansion anyway. He added that it saved them the trouble of sending a message about what happened. When they reached their carriage, Rufus suddenly sensed something strange nearby. A heavy feeling filled the air, and he thought he heard something from the sea. It sounded like a wave of magic pulling him down into the depths. He realized it was something familiar. Knowing the future, he had tried to change it, but he wondered if it had appeared too soon. It was the sea monster that was supposed to emerge 3 years later, the sea demon Strafe, one of the Demon King's vassal beasts. Rufus stood by the seashore for a while longer. Carlos called out to him, asking if he felt unwilling to leave the sea behind. Rufus walked toward the carriage, realizing that the butler had not sensed the strange wave of energy from earlier and seemed unaware of what had happened. Rufus muttered that he would never set foot in this place again. Soon after, they began their trip to Clinton's residence. Carlos swore that he would gather the needed evidence right away and deliver both it and Clinton to the family head. Rufus wondered what kind of excuse that man would come up with this time. When they reached Viperport Harbor Town where Clinton lived, Rufus looked more tired than ever. Clinton claimed he knew nothing about the recent events that had ruined the noble name of Lightless and caused looting in the area. He insisted that the tax collectors must have acted on their own and promised to find and punish those responsible for robbing the townspeople. Rufus found this neat excuse dull. Despite being called Snake by both name and nature, Clinton was acting more like a lizard that cut off its tail to escape danger. Rufus asked why the tax collection had fallen behind. The official replied that the peasants kept giving endless excuses. Rufus ignored the excuses and pressed for the real reason. Clinton explained that the townspeople claimed monsters had appeared in the nearby sea, ruining the fishing grounds and leaving them unable to pay their taxes. Rufus began to wonder if Roguebelt truly faced a fishing problem or if the monsters were real. He remembered seeing these events in a dream, though they were supposed to happen 3 years later. Sitting quietly, he fell deep into thought. Clinton added that he had never heard of a large-scale monster outbreak outside of dungeons. Rufus thought about how the fate of the village was linked to his own survival. He knew he had to stay focused because the future he once dreamed about was already starting. If the monster outbreak followed the same story he remembered, then the cause would be the colossal demon kraken, Strafe, which had once raged off the coast of Roguebelt. Even the two main heroes of that story had struggled to defeat it. The only way to win back then had been through a massive naval operation that cost a great amount of money. Powerful sea weapons were needed, and they were very expensive. In the story, the king's support during the Demon Lord's return had made it possible, but this time, Rufus had to find the funds on his own. At that moment, Carlos returned. Rufus said he had been waiting for him for quite some time and that he was already tired of talking with Clinton. Carlos leaned closer and quietly told him that he had found what they were searching for. It was in the next room and the basement below. Rufus smiled and covered part of his face with his hand, his mood improving right away. He declared that everything so far had been boring and said that Clinton seemed like a more interesting person. Clinton felt confused and shocked. Rufus explained that Clinton had been involved in unauthorized taxes, embezzlement, looting, and kidnapping. He said his servant had already gathered proof of all those crimes. But with a wide grin, Clinton thought that this kind of exposure was within his expectations. He believed that as long as he had money, he could recover. Rufus then announced that Carlos had found hidden money underground and even discovered a statue made of pure gold. Clinton jumped up, filled with fear and anger. He claimed he knew nothing about it. Rufus said that if that was true, Clinton would not mind if he took everything underground as well. Clinton broke into a cold sweat and clenched his teeth. Those were his hard-earned savings, money he had gathered with great effort. He could not bear the thought of losing it to some arrogant youth. Clinton raised his hand, but nothing happened. Rufus asked, almost teasingly, if Clinton had raised his hand to ask a question. He then asked the butler what he thought about the situation. Carlos explained that the gesture was actually a signal to call his armed men from the next room. Unfortunately for Clinton, they were already asleep. Nearby, the immobilized guards could be seen in the next room where Carlos had been earlier. Feeling cheerful, Rufus declared that this was now an assassination attempt on a high noble, which meant Clinton had added another crime to his record. This alone was enough reason for an execution. Realizing death was near, Clinton fell to his knees and begged for mercy, offering all the money he had saved. Carlos called him a fool and said that House Lightless would never be moved by bribes. Rufus concluded that he had already secured the money, but now he needed the weapons. He knew the kingdom controlled weapon trading, and the man before him had been smuggling goods and people for gold. A snake like Clinton surely knew his way around the black market, and Rufus wondered if he could use him. Then Rufus said he was willing to give Clinton a chance to atone for his sins. The butler was surprised since the master had just ordered him to collect evidence to report Clinton's crimes to the head of the family. Clinton brightened up and asked what he should do. Rufus told him that he was about to perform a noble act worthy of an aristocrat toward the common people. Clinton was surprised by this. Rufus explained that it might be a difficult task, but it would be a great way to make up for his crimes. Clinton happily agreed, saying he would do whatever was asked as long as he could be forgiven. Rufus was pleased with his answer and declared that Clinton must eliminate the sea monsters terrorizing Roguebelt. Clinton stepped back in fear, insisting that those monsters were just tales made up by peasants. Rufus asked for a pen and paper, saying that if there were no monsters, then that was even better. Still, he said that nobles had a duty to help their people in times of trouble, and this would show that sense of duty to everyone. Rufus handed a paper with newly written instructions to Clinton and told him to gather everything listed. Clinton read the note aloud. Personnel, weapons, ships, and ammunition. He panicked, unable to understand how such things could be collected so quickly. Rufus told him to use every contact and all the money they had saved. Everything had to be ready by the next morning. When Clinton said it was impossible, Rufus coldly replied that if it could not be done, then he might as well die there. As Carlos drew his sword, Clinton ran out in fear, shouting that he would prepare everything at once. After putting his sword back, Carlos called to his young master. Rufus turned to look at him and noticed the butler's troubled face. Carlos asked where Rufus had learned such cruel methods. Rufus wondered if Carlos planned to tell his father, but since they had sneaked out, Carlos said it was already too late for that. Rufus replied that his father would judge only by the results and asked Carlos to stay with him a little longer. Carlos agreed to follow his orders. Rufus knew he was the only one who could take action. Believing the cause of the suffering fishing village was already set, he decided to do whatever it took, even if it meant using dirty money. The next morning in Roguebelt, a young mother and her daughter went to the seashore to watch the sunrise. The girl gazed at the bright rays of the rising sun and noticed several ships moving closer from a distance. She told her mother that many large ships were coming their way. A boy sitting on a tree branch nearby realized that the nobles were attacking from the sea this time. He jumped down from the tree beside the mother and daughter. As the girl tried to run, she tripped and fell. The boy quickly lifted her up and asked if she was hurt. The girl was surprised to see the boy named Foal, but said she was fine. Foal smiled, knowing she was strong like most children raised in Roguebelt. He told her it was time to play hide and seek and warned her not to let anyone from outside the village find them. Then he ran toward the shore. He did not care who the attackers were. The moment they stepped on land, he would defend everyone in the village this time. Meanwhile, as the ships neared the shore, Rufus and Carlos climbed into a rowboat and started rowing toward land. Carlos mentioned that even if they had never planned to return, fate seemed to have pulled them back to Roguebelt. Rufus said it was troublesome that they still needed someone who knew the waters well. As they got closer, Carlos noticed how cautious the villagers looked. Rufus hoped the people would calm down once they recognized their faces. The first person to meet them on the shore was Greg, the leader of the sailors. He said they had vanished the day before without even saying goodbye, and now they had suddenly come back. Rufus explained that the villagers could not pay their taxes because of the monsters, so it was time to deal with the problem once and for all. Greg was shocked. He looked at the fleet anchored near the coast and wondered if they had gathered all those ships just to wipe out the sea monsters. Rufus told him he did not come for a small extermination. He said he would wipe out the monsters completely and destroy every last one of them. He also told Greg that the villagers should stay hidden and keep out of the way. Greg apologized and admitted that just the day before he had disliked all nobles, but now he found himself deeply admiring Rufus. Rufus told him not to go too far with the compliments because they were starting to bother him. Greg then asked why Rufus cared so much about their village. Rufus replied that he had already dealt with a troublesome snake. Greg asked if he meant Clinton, but before he could answer, a young man appeared at the pier. He drew his weapon in anger and rushed toward them. Carlos quickly pulled out his own weapon and blocked the attack, but Foal dashed at Rufus with unbelievable speed and landed a punch on his face. Carlos shouted for his young master, but Rufus said he was fine and ordered him not to interfere. Blood dripped from his mouth as Rufus admitted he had grown overconfident. Foal was stunned by the killing intent he felt from someone so young. Rufus had already noticed Foal charging from a distance, but his speed up close was incredible, and he had gone straight for Rufus, the leader himself. Greg yelled at Foal, calling him a fool for attacking the man who came to help the village. Foal asked if this was really the noble everyone was calling their savior. Greg confirmed it was true, but Foal said that was all the more reason not to let them into the village. Rufus taunted him for acting ungrateful toward the person trying to save them, then agreed to hear what he had to say. Greg angrily told Foal to stop, but Carlos calmly said there was no need for Greg to step in. Foal, still filled with rage, charged at Rufus again, shouting that he would never forgive him for fooling everyone in the village. Meanwhile, Rufus could not understand what he was being blamed for. Foal jumped at him, yelling that everyone had changed. In just one day, both his father and Lilia had started saying that Rufus was a good noble. The fight between Rufus and Foal went on, with Rufus only defending himself. Because of his skill and speed, it was easy for him to avoid Foal's attacks. Foal swung again, saying that no one could trick him. Rufus finally fought back and landed a hit. He tried to calm Foal down and told him to listen carefully. He explained that he had driven the corrupt tax collectors out of the village. If that didn't make him a good noble, he then asked what truly made one. Foal hesitated, confused, and said that a good noble was someone who didn't collect taxes. Rufus called that foolish and decided to show him what a true noble really was. He rushed forward, jumped, and kicked Foal in the jaw. Rufus said that a good noble wasn't someone who just made things easy for everyone. Foal, unable to block the sharp attack, fell to the ground. Rufus noticed that Foal wasn't an ordinary boy, seeing how strangely he moved, but he had already figured out his limits. He turned to Greg and asked who the boy was, saying that he had no manners. Greg replied that Foal was the youngest of 3 sons and admitted that they had spoiled him a bit. Still lying on the ground, Foal remembered a girl holding a flower, telling him never to forgive the nobles, especially Clinton and the Lightless. A memory flashed. He saw a woman crying and a house burning down. Slowly, he got back on his feet and shouted that there were no good nobles, only scum. Rufus couldn't understand where Foal's strength was coming from. He wondered if it was mana. The fight went on. Foal punched Rufus and actually hit him. Rufus realized that Foal was unconsciously using magic to strengthen his body. Foal kept chasing after him as Rufus stayed on the defensive, backing away step by step. Soon Rufus reached the edge of the pier. Foal leaped toward him with deadly intent and Rufus felt trapped. In an instant, he enhanced his body and did a somersault, shocking Foal, who lost his balance and fell into the water. Rufus quickly used his dark hand to grab the edge of the pier and pulled himself back up. He couldn't believe that a mere boy had forced him to use magic. The butler rushed over to Rufus, clearly worried. Carlos came closer, checked his master's condition, and used healing magic to fix the small injuries right away. Rufus felt thankful and told Carlos to add more martial arts lessons to his training schedule. Carlos agreed and thought to himself that the young master really hated losing, which was actually a good trait. Greg apologized to Rufus for the little one's behavior. Rufus said that if the fight had happened yesterday, he would have cut Foal in half. Greg replied that Foal was lucky today. He also mentioned that most of the village youth, including Foal, had been out hunting monsters the other day. Rufus was surprised to learn that commoners without magic dared to do such a thing. Greg explained that even without Foal, the others were still capable fighters. Then he asked Rufus to let his kid join him in the cleanup operation, saying it would be their way of helping the village. Rufus was taken aback by the way Greg put it. He reminded him not to flatter himself, saying that it was natural for commoners to work for nobles. Still, he added that he was willing to pay them for their help. Greg was pleased to hear this and took it as good news. Rufus then suggested ending the small talk and getting to work. He told Greg to gather everyone who was ready to help and bring them to the ships. Greg chuckled and said Rufus was always in a hurry. Soon after, the ship set sail. A strong group of volunteers had gathered, ready to fight the sea monsters. Rufus lined up the crew on the deck, then stood on the captain's bridge to inspect them. He believed they had enough strength to defeat the creatures. If they succeeded, everyone would be able to return home and continue fishing as before. One of the first to approach Rufus was a young man named Raj, the eldest son of Greg, the leader of the village's young men. Rufus nodded in understanding while Carlos quietly noted that Raj was tall and strong. Raj explained that the sea was like their own backyard and offered to be their guide. Rufus thought the young man looked far better than shark bait, and Carlos struggled not to laugh. Suddenly, someone shouted angrily at Rufus and climbed aboard the ship. It was Foal, who yelled that Rufus could not escape from him and called him a black beansprout. Carlos again tried not to laugh. Raj turned in surprise and asked why Foal was there since he was supposed to stay in the village. Foal said things just happened that way, and he had managed to catch up by riding a dolphin before climbing aboard. He told them to ignore that part and loudly declared that his fight with Rufus was not finished. Rufus reminded him that he had already lost by being thrown out of the ring. Foal shouted that it was unfair because Rufus had used those strange black hands, so the match did not count. Rufus sighed and said that anyone who refused to follow his orders was useless, then ordered someone to throw Foal overboard. Raj told him not to be ridiculous, since they were already far from shore. Foal stuck out his tongue and laughed at Rufus, but his own brother betrayed him by shoving him into a barrel to keep him quiet. Raj apologized for his useless brother, but Rufus said he understood since he also had a foolish younger brother. From inside the barrel, Foal shouted that Raj had been charmed too. Raj calmly replied that, for now, he only cared about finishing his job. Rufus agreed, saying their focus should be on reaching their goal. Foal kept shouting, warning them not to trust Rufus because he would betray them and sell them overseas. He claimed that some noble was probably pulling the strings from the ship behind them. Rufus couldn't admit that a corrupt noble really was in that other ship, but he suddenly sensed something approaching from that direction. Carlos called out to him and Rufus said he already knew. The sea looked calm, but the tension grew. Foal teased Rufus, asking if he had struck a nerve since Rufus couldn't even talk back. Rufus stayed silent, trying to figure out what was happening, but Foal called him shorty. That was when Rufus finally lost his patience. He summoned his dark spear magic and warned everyone not to move, saying he would end everything with one powerful strike. Foal mocked him again, saying Rufus only used magic because he couldn't win in a fair fight. Worried for his brother, Raj promised to silence him and begged Carlos to stop Rufus. But Carlos calmly reminded him that his master had ordered everyone to stay still, and he asked Raj not to move either. Suddenly, the ship rocked hard from side to side. Something massive was rising from the water nearby. Raj's eyes widened when he saw a giant sea serpent emerging so close to the coast. He quickly ordered his men to attack together and prepare the net ship and harpoons. The monster lunged toward them, but Rufus unleashed his dark spear magic. The dark spear pierced through the serpent in one powerful strike. Everyone stood in disbelief. Rufus had taken down the monster all by himself. As the serpent fell back into the sea while its body burned, it glared at Rufus with glowing red eyes. Rufus froze, confused and unsettled by the sight. The monster tried to attack once more, but Rufus quickly used his dark ball magic. Many black orbs formed and floated around him, keeping everyone safe. During the chaos, Foal fell helplessly to the floor. When the danger was over, Raj was the first to approach Rufus and thank him for saving them. He had never seen such a vicious monster before. Even after its head was cut off, it still kept moving and attacking. Rufus then remembered something similar from one of his dreams. In that dream, a group of heroes fought powerful monsters that behaved in the same way. He recalled that the red glowing eyes were a sign of beasts driven mad by the demon lord's return. It seemed likely that this monster had been summoned by the demon servant Strafe. Still, everything was happening just as Rufus expected, and he was ready for whatever came next. He told Raj that their work was not over yet and that they needed to stay alert. Raj agreed despite believing they were still safe in the area, and then ordered everyone to stay on guard and start cleaning up the ship. After that, Rufus went over to Foal, who was still tied down on the floor. He teased him for losing his nerve and called him pathetic. The sight made Rufus burst into laughter. Still, he gave Foal credit for not begging for his life during the attack and praised his courage. Carlos, watching from nearby, felt relieved that his young master seemed to be in good spirits again. Foal's face turned completely red from embarrassment. He complained that Rufus had aimed for the sea serpent from the very beginning and never planned to fight him at all. Rufus replied that it was obvious since he would never waste a mid-level spell on someone as weak as Foal. After hearing that, Foal began acting proud again. He questioned why someone with such powerful magic still needed to involve the villagers. He said that Rufus should be able to defeat the sea monsters by himself, though he secretly thought that was impossible even for Rufus. Rufus calmly said that it was possible for him, but it was not something a noble like him should personally do. Foal was shocked that Rufus had such confidence. Rufus explained that he only handled tasks that were essential to his plans, and that duties others could manage should be assigned to them. He said that was the responsibility of a true leader. Then he reminded Foal that the village had already been saved and asked what he still had to complain about. Foal answered that Rufus simply gave him an eerie feeling. They had only met him a few days ago, yet he was willing to use such extreme power to help the village. Foal asked what Rufus stood to gain from it. Rufus replied that a true noble did not act out of personal benefit but for the sake of duty and the greater good. He added that he was not helping only because the villagers were in danger, but because the threat could destroy the fishing trade and harm the entire kingdom's economy. Foal froze in place, his face blank with confusion. When Rufus looked at him, he wondered why Foal still appeared lost and guessed that he might not believe him. The truth was simpler. Foal just could not understand everything Rufus said. Yet in one sense, Foal was right. Rufus had only told part of the truth. The real reason was much deeper. Rufus knew no one would believe him if he admitted that he had seen all of this in a dream. In reality, he was fighting to prevent his own death in the future. Turning his back on Foal, Rufus muttered to himself about how troublesome everything had become. Rufus loudly declared that the monster hunt was for his own sake, and that he was not taking orders from anyone. He even said he had come to the sea without telling his parents. Foal couldn't help but laugh when he realized Rufus was just a runaway child. Rufus grew angry and demanded to know what was wrong with that. Foal was startled by his sudden anger. Rufus told him to listen carefully. He said he never backed down from anything, no matter his position. Once he decided to act, he faced things directly, even if it cost him his life, and he always saw them through to the end. Foal then thought that all this power showed how serious Rufus really was. Rufus told him to return to his barrel quietly and behave if he understood, but Foal refused. He asked if Rufus was truly sure about his words. He reminded him that although he had defeated the sea serpent alone, he had also managed to land a hit on Rufus. If he had not been tied up, he believed he could have taken down a sea serpent too. Rufus clicked his tongue, wondering what Foal was trying to say. Foal claimed he would use his arms to match Rufus's full strength and would not just sit around cleaning up after him. Rufus could not believe Foal had the nerve to speak like that. Foal laughed and said he could not help it since Rufus was shorter. Rufus's patience finally broke and he summoned a large dark ball, asking if Foal truly had a death wish. Carlos quickly asked his young master to calm down. Just then, Raj returned, called Foal a fool for provoking the captain, and gave him a punch. Later, inside the ship's cabin while preparing tea, Carlos commented that Foal surely knew how to make himself noticed. Rufus told him to stay quiet and said that if Foal resisted again, he would throw him into the sea. Still, Rufus began to think about things more carefully. There had been no one named Foal in Roguebelt in his dream. He wondered if Foal had left the village sometime during those 3 years. With a personality like that, it would not have been surprising if Foal had picked a fight with the wrong noble and ended up dead. Even more, Rufus could not forget the strange chill he had felt along his spine back then. It made him both confused and curious. When Carlos finally served the tea, he remarked that their journey was going to be an interesting one. Rufus asked if his butler was blind, saying he was already tired of everything. And so began the trip that Rufus would never forget for the rest of his life. Later, in the northeastern waters near the Lightless domain, Rufus's fleet sailed north, defeating every monster swarm they came across. A wild fishman suddenly attacked, but Foal quickly cut it down with a single sword strike. Everyone else fought hard too. They weren't afraid to give it their all since they had plenty of healing potions to rely on. They felt lucky to have such a generous noble with them. Foal shouted at the crew not to let Rufus take all the credit. Raj laughed, saying that with this monster cleanup, their village would be safe for a while. Foal agreed but said that wasn't the real issue. He complained that Rufus wasn't even helping. Rufus only smirked and told him to remember the difference between nobles and commoners. He said Foal should engrave that truth deep into his heart. Foal grumbled that Rufus didn't even plan to move an inch. Rufus reminded him that he was the one who bragged about being able to take down a sea serpent and said he wanted to see those skills for himself. Carlos, their butler, smiled quietly. He was glad to see his young master enjoying himself. Rufus Lay Lightless was the heir to the Marquis of Lightless, one of the most powerful nobles in the Centerio kingdom, and a boy gifted with incredible magical talent. Yet Carlos couldn't help but feel a little sorry for him. At only 12 years old, Rufus already carried the duties of a noble and had no chance to live like a normal child. Seeing him bicker and spar with someone his age, like Foal, felt refreshing to Carlos. That boy might actually become a good influence on the young master. Rufus then remarked that the Roguebelt sailors were truly fearless. He was surprised he had nothing to do, even when facing such a large horde. He added that Foal could probably grow a lot stronger under Carlos's training. Carlos nodded and said he would keep that in mind. Suddenly, some sailors approached Rufus, saying they needed to talk. Raj stepped forward and mentioned that it might be time to turn back. Rufus frowned and asked what he meant. Foal and Carlos spread out the map while Raj explained that they had been sailing north for half a day now. He pointed out that beyond their current position lay the Devil's Sea. It was said that a demon that devoured ships had lived there for 300 years, and every sailor along the coast knew that legend. Hearing this, Rufus guessed it was probably just another old sea story or ghost tale. Foal angrily told him not to make fun of the legends. He said it was true that every ship that sailed into the Devil's Sea never returned. Carlos agreed, saying it was a dangerous place and that was why the northern route had stayed unopened. Rufus then realized it might not just be a dangerous passage, but something even worse. He felt something unpleasant seeping through his magical barrier. As he thought about it, Rufus suddenly felt a strange pressure inside him. Carlos asked if he was all right. Judging from Carlos's tired look, it seemed he had also felt it. That made Rufus realize the magic surge in the area was stronger than before. Carlos apologized, while Foal also looked sick. Raj grew worried and asked what was happening. Rufus wasn't surprised, since Foal was a commoner who could use mana. After drinking some water, Foal asked if the butler was fine. Carlos said he was and wondered if they were just seasick. Foal said that might be true for Carlos, but he also felt dizzy himself. He complained that the feeling wouldn't go away. Raj turned to Rufus and suggested turning back, saying he felt something bad was coming. Rufus then realized that the old tales about the ship-eating demon weren't all lies. The fleet wasn't actually formed to clear out normal sea monsters, but to defeat the sea demon Strafe, a massive kraken-like beast that ruled the Devil's Sea. It served as a demon lord, and no one else but Rufus knew this. He couldn't explain such a wild truth to everyone, but in some ways this made things clearer for him. Rufus told Raj there was no reason to retreat since his true goal was to slay the ship-eating demon. Shocked, Raj asked how he planned to do that. Rufus said the information he had gathered pointed to this demon as the cause of the recent monster outbreaks. Raj complained that this wasn't part of their mission, and couldn't believe they were actually heading to fight the Devil Seas demon. Rufus found it hard to believe that someone so big could be so scared. Raj corrected him, saying he was only being careful. Foal then asked if the fish would return once the demon was defeated. Rufus said that was the plan from the beginning. Foal nodded, saying they had no choice but to take down the demon. Rufus already had an idea of what kind of enemy they would face, but the boy in front of him knew nothing. He wondered if Foal was reckless or just too brave for his own good. And so, they continued north to uncover the truth behind the ship-eating demon. Foal knew that if the worst happened, Rufus still had stronger magic than what he used against the sea serpent. Rufus warned him not to grow overconfident in front of him. The fleet kept moving forward, and soon, night fell over the sea. It was quiet, but Rufus knew the demon was still out there. He sensed that the burst of magic had come from Strafe. Rufus sat on the deck with his eyes closed, meditating to feel any movement around the area. Suddenly, someone threw something at him, and he caught it easily. It was an apple. Foal was surprised to see Rufus catch it without even opening his eyes. Rufus told him he was disturbing his meditation and that he should leave. Foal called him harsh and said he wasn't there to start a fight. He only wanted to ask if Rufus had eaten, since he had been sitting there for a long time. Rufus said he hadn't, but that it wasn't any of Foal's business. He thought Foal came to pick a fight, but instead the man seemed worried about his meal. Rufus couldn't understand what this commoner was thinking. Foal then said he also wanted to apologize. Without hesitation, he bowed down to the floor and said sorry for punching Rufus at the pier and accusing him without proof. Rufus asked what was wrong with him all of a sudden. Foal explained that since they had a big mission to defeat the demon of the Devil's Sea, he thought it would be better if they worked together without any grudges. Rufus said it was nonsense. As long as they followed his orders, he would make use of them, even if they still held hatred toward him. When Foal heard the words killing intent, he started to sweat. He admitted he once had those feelings too. He told Rufus what happened half a year ago when their group ran out of goods and gold to pay the taxes. While Foal was away, one of Clinton's men kidnapped his childhood friend. Rufus stayed silent as Foal went on. Even after that, the same men kept coming, calling it tax collection when it was nothing but robbery. The villagers were treated with cruelty just because they couldn't pay. Foal asked if they were supposed to endure all of it. When he saw the ships approaching, he swore to protect his village and everyone in it. But somewhere along the way, that resolve turned into hatred for Rufus when he saw him. That was the killing intent Rufus had sensed back then. Foal truly apologized, saying he didn't even understand himself anymore. He forgot that their real enemies were Clinton, his men, and those who allowed such crimes to continue. Rufus understood and admitted that Foal was right. He also wondered why his father had allowed Clinton to act so freely, yet he knew his father was not the kind of man to ignore someone like that. If anything, he would have dealt with Clinton himself, but he never did. The lightless territory was wide and full of shadows. That night, the apple in Rufus's hand tasted strangely sour. Foal was surprised that Rufus finished the apple without any complaints. He remembered that when he ate one before, his face twisted because of how sour it was. He expected someone like Rufus, a noble, to make the same funny face. But Rufus only looked embarrassed. He said he had no interest in the words of a mere commoner and told Foal to leave if he was done talking. Foal stayed quiet for a moment, then said the fight they had earlier was actually a kind of conversation. Rufus frowned and asked what he meant. Foal stood up and filled his fists with mana, saying it was time for round 2, and that he wanted to finish things with his bare hands. Rufus sighed, complaining that he could not even meditate in peace. He told Foal to drop his magic first before suggesting a fight with fists only. Confused, Foal asked if he was talking about the kind of magic only nobles could use. Rufus explained that although it was rare, some commoners could have it too. He pointed out that Foal also had magic power. Foal's eyes lit up and he asked if he could use the same kind of magic as Rufus. Rufus called him a fool and warned him not to make fun of mages when he knew nothing about the training it required. Rufus then explained that Foal's strange strength came from unconsciously using magic to strengthen his body. That was all he was capable of, Rufus said, and told him to know his place. Annoyed, Foal asked if he could not just learn to control it himself. Rufus felt like he had just lost the argument. He turned away and said that with enough training, Foal might reach Carlos's level one day. Foal started imagining himself growing much stronger if he could learn the old butler's techniques. Suddenly, the ship began to shake violently. A massive tentacle burst out of the water. Foal wondered if it was another sea serpent, but when he saw the round suckers, he realized it was a kraken, an enormous one. Even Rufus could see that this creature was far larger than any kraken he had heard of. Carlos came rushing out of the cabin and Rufus shouted that they were under attack. The giant kraken had already wrapped its tentacles around the ship, trying to drag it down into the sea. Everyone finally saw the legendary ship-eater they had only heard about in stories. Rufus sprang into action and ordered Carlos to move as well. Carlos drew his sword and followed his young master's lead. Foal's eyes widened as he stared at Carlos. Carlos said he only needed to steal the old man's techniques for himself. Teasing him, Carlos wondered if he really could. Then he charged his legs with magic and flew upward, spinning his rapier as he went. In a blink, he cut the huge tentacle into pieces. At the same time, Rufus summoned his dark scythe and rushed straight toward the kraken's main body. But the creature shifted the ship, and the mass suddenly blocked his path. Rufus quickly used a spell called Dark Cliff, surrounding the whole ship with barriers. The strong force pushed the kraken back into the sea. Carlos saw the monster retreat and stay below them, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Meanwhile, Foal felt pleased with what he had seen from Carlos. He remembered his father once calling the old butler amazing too. Carlos teasingly asked if Foal had learned something, but Foal said everything had happened so fast that he could hardly understand it. He then asked excitedly if he could also do that kind of swoosh and whoosh move. Rufus came up from behind and kicked him like a ball. Foal angrily asked what was wrong with him. Rufus couldn't believe Foal froze in fear during such a serious moment and called him pathetic. Foal shouted that he wasn't scared, just surprised. Rufus told him to get his stance ready since the fight was not over yet. As they walked away, Carlos jokingly warned Rufus that he might become Foal's first friend instead of him. Rufus looked annoyed at the comment but wondered why Carlos suddenly brought that up. Carlos knew his young master could be cold and slow to notice such things. Rufus leaned against the rail and watched the shadow of the kraken below. He wondered how someone like him had failed to sense such a massive creature coming. Raj finally appeared on the deck and asked if the ship-eating demon was actually a giant kraken. Rufus pointed out that the creature was still clinging right beneath them. Foal said it was going to be a long fight, just like catching a huge fish. Raj told them to stop joking and take things seriously. The ship suddenly shook, and Rufus warned that the greedy octopus was starting to move. Foal noticed something strange and looked into the water. There he saw sea minions climbing up the ship. He wondered if the kraken had summoned them. Rufus told Raj and the others to handle the sea minions while he focused on the main threat. Calling for Carlos, Rufus summoned his dark scythe again. He believed that the kraken below was the same ship-eater from legends 300 years ago. Still, he knew this one wasn't Strafe. The creature in his dream had been as big as a small island. Rufus and Carlos cut through the kraken's tentacles with powerful strikes. If this wasn't Strafe, Rufus wondered if killing it would really stop the monster outbreaks. And if not, could he still avoid his own death? Lost in thought, he almost missed Foal shouting a warning. Before Rufus could react, Foal rushed behind him and sliced a sea minion clean in half. Rufus hadn't expected Foal to protect him like that. Foal then said that Rufus owed him his life now and should be grateful forever. But at that same moment, Rufus cut down another sea minion that had tried to ambush Foal. Rufus pointed out that he had saved Foal too, and asked what kind of lifelong gratitude he was talking about. Foal looked disappointed, realizing he had just lost his best bargaining chip to gain favors from a noble. More monsters climbed aboard, but the young men fought them off with ease, still arguing while they fought. Foal told him to be careful. Rufus sensed something was wrong and called out to Carlos. He warned his butler that he was failing in his duty to protect him. Carlos came out from hiding, apologizing. He said he had only been admiring how healthy his young master had grown. Even after cutting down many tentacles, they kept coming. Carlos guessed there was more than one kraken. Rufus told him not to be foolish, saying there was no way several of those creatures could exist at once. What mattered more was ending the battle quickly. Suddenly, a telepathy crystal floated out of his pocket. Rufus realized it was a message from Clinton. He asked what Clinton wanted. Carlos noticed that his master was speaking through telepathy. Clinton quickly reported that they could not hold out against the number of monsters and that they were retreating. Rufus did not mind letting them flee, but he made it clear he would personally sink their ship. Clinton questioned if Rufus should really speak that way. He said he would leave for real and tell the Lord about Rufus's noble resolve and how he risked his life for his people. The telepathic message then ended. Rufus could not believe Clinton acted like a coward until the very end. Carlos could even see Clinton's ship sailing away to a safe distance. Rufus complained that they had let the kraken distract them too much. Carlos agreed and said Clinton had tricked them well. Rufus replied that Clinton could wait and that they should first deal with whatever was under them. He raised his dark lance high into the air. Carlos guessed his young master planned to pierce the sea from above. Rufus praised him for being sharp. Still, Carlos worried that a mid-tier spell might not be strong enough and suggested he at least use a chant. Hearing that, Rufus grew angry and asked if the old butler dared to imply he would lower himself like a mere servant. Carlos turned pale and quickly said his words came only from the shallow thoughts of an amateur. Rufus then declared that he would show him the real thing. His dark lance grew larger, turning into a massive black harpoon even bigger than the ship. Rufus said those tears were only useless labels made by scholars. Carlos stood speechless as Rufus poured in his enormous magic power, said to be the greatest in the history of the Lightless family. It was a reckless move, but its strength could surpass even upper-tier spells. Foal warned Rufus not to aim toward their ship or they would sink. The monster was right beneath them, so Rufus thought he should attack from an angle, but he ignored the warning and launched his dark lance straight at the creature. He shouted for everyone to hold on to something if they did not want to die. Foal yelled in anger, asking if Rufus even understood the meaning of restraint. The dark lance struck the kraken directly and the ship leapt off the water as a huge explosion erupted below. Everyone panicked when the ship shook from the impact, and several people were thrown overboard. Seeing them fall into the water, Rufus used his dark hand to pull them back onto the ship. He dropped them roughly one by one and reminded them that he didn't join the subjugation just to be surrounded by unreliable, sweaty men. Carlos looked over the water and asked if they had finally done it. He praised his young master for such incredible power. Raj quickly warned him not to jinx their victory by saying that. Then Foal noticed the water moving and said the monster might be getting back up. Raj expected that to happen after the old butler's careless comment. Everyone stood still as the kraken's face rose from the water again, though it barely moved. They thought there was no way it could still be alive after Rufus had punched a hole through its stomach. Rufus pointed out that its tentacles were still twitching. Foal agreed, saying it was only natural since the body was still fresh. Raj then dropped his spear and called out to Rufus as his captain before hugging him tightly. He couldn't believe Rufus had actually defeated a living legend with a single magical strike. Rufus quickly slipped away behind his butler and told the siblings to stop, complaining that they were just as clingy as their father. When things finally calmed down, Rufus continued staring at the water's surface. Earlier, he had concluded that the kraken they fought wasn't Strafe because it seemed smaller in size, but when he looked closer, he noticed that the striped pattern on its belly matched Strafe exactly. The ship-eater looked like a smaller version of the sea demon Strafe. The reason for Strafe's island-sized growth remained unknown, but Rufus suspected it had something to do with the first chapter's final boss, the demon lord Lars. The ship-eater that had survived for 300 years had eventually evolved into the sea demon Strafe, one of the demon lord's 4 magical beasts. Rufus stayed silent for a moment, thinking about how fascinating it would be to turn a legendary creature into his familiar. He decided that he would claim the demon lord for himself first. Then he activated his skill, Devour. A dark murky liquid spread around him, crawling over the ship and spilling into the water. When the others asked what it was, Rufus explained that it was Shadow Eater, a spell that absorbed the dead into the shadows and bound them as familiars. As long as his magic lasted, they would become immortal soldiers. Foal took a stance, ready for another fight, but Rufus remained calm. He remarked that the title Ship-Eating Demon didn't sound right and decided to give the monster a better name. In the end, he named the kraken Strafe himself. Foal panicked when he saw the monster. He said it looked scarier than before, almost too creepy to watch. Rufus scolded him for being rude, but he secretly agreed that his dark magic always looked unpleasant. Still, he could feel his magic power fading quickly. With a massive body like that, he figured it was only natural. His special magic, Shadow Eater, was a spell passed down only through the lightless bloodline. It was the reason he earned the title of one of the 4 heavenly kings. By commanding an army of shadow familiars spread across the continent, he became known and feared as the Shadow Wolf. He had poured nearly all his magic into those familiars, and because of that, he could barely use proper spells when facing the heroes. That was how the Shadow Wolf was defeated. Rufus guessed his current weak magic was because of that. He decided not to push Strafe any further and ordered it back to the Shadow Realm. Carlos praised his young master for doing well. Raj then said they had hunted enough monsters for the day and suggested returning to Roguebelt. Foal still couldn't believe that the terrifying ship-eater had ended up fighting for their side. But Rufus wasn't convinced it was over. Many questions still bothered him. The ship-eater had existed for 300 years, so why had it suddenly caused a huge monster outbreak? And did those red-eyed beasts mean the Demon Lord's return was near? Just then, something bright flared in the sky over the horizon. Foal asked if they were fireworks, but Rufus doubted it since they were in the middle of the sea. Deep down, he knew the light came from the direction of Clinton's ship. Soon after, Carlos asked if the explosion earlier was from Clinton's ship. Rufus thought it probably was, since the telepathy crystal wasn't giving any response. He figured they must have been attacked by monsters too. Carlos agreed, saying they had been too busy dealing with the ship-eater to help. He felt guilty that they couldn't save them. Rufus only laughed and told his butler to think of it as trash taking itself out. Suddenly, Rufus sensed something rushing toward them at great speed. It wasn't slowing down. He thought it might be the ship-eater, but it wasn't. The dark energy it carried was terrifying. Realizing the danger, Rufus shouted that it wasn't over yet and told everyone to prepare for battle. A deafening roar shook the air and even the sea itself trembled. Everyone felt like their heads were about to split from the loud roar. Rufus saw that even those without magic were struggling to stand. The pressure of the magic was far stronger than anything he had ever felt. even greater than the 4 magical beasts. Then he noticed Raj on the floor trembling and apologizing. Rufus told him to get up and handed him a healing potion, saying it was as good as fine liquor for someone like him. As Raj recovered from the crushing magic pressure, Rufus ordered him to take the injured below deck since they would only get in the way. Raj protested, saying they couldn't let their captain fight alone. Rufus snapped at him to stop complaining and reminded him that the rest of the sailors were under his command. Realizing his mistake, Raj nodded and with the help of the others carried the wounded away. Rufus looked around and saw that only 2 were still standing firm, Foal and Carlos. Foal proudly said he was already getting used to this kind of chaos. Hearing that, Rufus understood why he hadn't sensed the ship-eater before it attacked. He had become too used to the powerful waves of magic around them. He realized they were already deep inside the enemy's territory, like being caught in its hand. Carlos asked what kind of enemy they were facing. Rufus admitted he had no idea, but he was sure it was the same creature that had sunk the fleeing ship earlier. Even with their own vessel, they probably couldn't escape. If it turned out to be hostile, they would have to fight. He thought that if his choices had caused the story to move faster than it should, then a powerful foe might have appeared sooner than expected. He then asked the 2 if they were ready to die. Carlos lowered his head and said he would gladly give his life if that was his young master's order. Foal called the old butler crazy, saying he wasn't ready to die because he believed they would all make it back alive. Rufus said his words sounded ominous. Foal asked why, wondering if Rufus was about to start sounding like his scared brother again. Rufus told him to stop talking since the enemy was coming. He turned his eyes toward the sea. He already knew how this story went. No matter what appeared, someone like him could defeat it. Then something began to rise from the water. Everyone looked up as a massive whale-like monster with sharp horns, wide flippers, and a long tail burst out of the ocean and soared into the air. Rufus froze in shock. He asked what it was because this kind of monster was never in the story.